Hey there, we're continuing on now with our lesson 2 in our brand new series. We just launched a brand new series called The Story of God. My intent is to go through the main theme and the stories of the Bible from Genesis to Revelation, and in doing so, we're going to form a big picture framework and understanding of God's story and His glory, of course. Pardon me. And one of my contentions is that as we all continue to study and learn details about God and about what He's doing, we have to have somewhere to hang those details to put them all in context, to make sure that we understand all of the details that we are accumulating. And we have to understand that when it comes to discipleship, knowledge of the history of God and the history of His people is just as important as sound doctrine. And in fact, I would suggest that you can't have one without the other, because doctrine really should develop with a progressive understanding of God's story and how He's been dealing with His people for thousands of years. And while we mourn the tendency of some Christian churches or some Christians to ignore the Old Testament, and mostly out of ignorance, I would firmly denounce any pastor, any church, or any denomination that unfaithfully teaches that the Old Testament itself is irrelevant. And I think most recently I shared how a pastor in Georgia, Andy Stanley, who leads a mega church up there, has just in this past year basically told his followers, and I'm going to use that word intentionally, have told his followers to essentially rip out the Old Testament from the Bible, which is nonsensical. We understand God has revealed Himself to mankind progressively over time, and in order to understand the end of the story, you have to know the beginning. Nobody ever watches the last 5 minutes of a movie before they watch the introduction or the beginning. And nobody, well, actually, I do know some people who do this. I was going to say nobody reads the last chapter of a book before reading, say, the prologue. But actually, I do know some people who do that. But that's where we are right now. We're in the prologue to the story. We're in the introduction. And in lesson 1 last week, just very quickly, we talked about how all Christians need to consciously and intentionally form their worldview, because if we don't, then the world is going to form it for us. And that's critical, because our worldview is the lens through which we see everything. It colors our perception of our lives, the world around us, and of course, including the Bible and how we interpret what the Bible is telling us. And last week, I loosely quoted from Ravi Zacharias, and I told you that he has this 3-4-5 methodology. And he says that any worldview has to pass 3 tests, answer 4 questions, and then be predicated on 5 different areas of academic discipline or study. We know that worldviews in their teachings, looking at the 3 tests, they have to be logical, they have to be verifiable, they have to be applicable or practical when it comes to your daily life. And the 4 questions that any worldview has to answer have to do with origin, they have to do with meaning, morality, as well as destiny. And they have to be based on the study of theology, metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, and anthropology. And what we're doing in the study is we're doing the theology portion of that. And I ended up briefly last week by showing you how each of the 4 win statements of faith addresses these 4 main questions, the ones of origin, meaning, morality, as well as destiny. So today we move on to lesson 2. I think most of you guys know that I'm sitting in a hotel room here in San Francisco. In fact, you can see outside, I think it's still fairly early. The time change, I'm usually up around 3 o'clock in the morning, West Coast time when I come over here. So I've got my my trusted coffee to keep me going. My body clock is screaming at me right now. But nevertheless, I'm actually very excited to go through this. This past week and preparing for this lesson has been great for me on a personal level. I've always understood the Genesis story, the Genesis account. I've always taken it literally. But there are some things and nuances that I came to understand this past week. And I think I mentioned last week when we were talking about how, maybe you start, most of us as children, we learn, Bible stories, right? We don't learn theology, doctrine, etc. as children for the most part. But then we get into these Bible study habits or environments where it's about accumulating details. And over the last few years, as we've clarified our position on some very, very big questions about doctrine, it has changed how we look at the Bible. And that's now affected me when I've gone back and started to look at the Genesis account again. And I'm going to show you some of those things as we go through. So today we're starting lesson 2, and for the next several weeks, we're going to be covering the main events of Genesis chapters 1 through chapter 11. We're going to deal with chapter 1 today. And I want to make sure that you're reading ahead on your own, just very simply because it's going to take us a full year to tell the story. And because we're focusing on the main themes and stories and the main characters, the parts of the story that are most important to that overall framework and understanding, that means we're not really going line by line, even though at some point sometimes we actually will go line by line. But I want to make sure that you, whenever we're going through these big sections, that you're reading these things on your own in your personal study time. And just remember that the study itself is not about developing doctrine, although I think that developing sound doctrine is a natural outcome of studying the Bible progressively like we're going to do. So again, we're going to be touching on the high points. Now, when it comes to the book of Genesis, just for general context, the book of Genesis was written by Moses, and it was written by him when they were wandering in the desert in the wilderness for those 40 years after they refused to go into the promised land. And that's a story we'll get to a little bit down the road. But in terms of time frames, this is 2,500 years after creation. So we're reading the account of what Moses wrote, but he's writing about events that happened 2,500 years before he was alive and before he actually was writing them. And in our Bible-based view, in our Bible-based worldview, that implies that he probably received the details of the creation week, either when he spent 40 days with the pre-incarnate Christ up on Mt Sinai after they came out of Egypt, or perhaps he was given it progressively, during the many times when God appeared to him in the tabernacle of meeting during the 40 years that he was in the desert. And, I can almost imagine Moses going in and communing with God and then coming out with some more details and writing them down and eventually collating them into this sequential account that we see in Genesis chapter 1. Genesis 1 is entirely about the creation story. And in fact, the name Genesis itself means origin. So this is the book of Genesis is the book of origins, the book of the beginning. And you might already know this, but there are different views on the creation account. They range from the literal, which is what we believe in, literal versus metaphorical. And we look at the Genesis account really as history, but some scholars look at it as poetry. And that's very interesting because then, those different perspectives, those worldviews, if you will, or aspects of that, then influence how they interpret the Genesis account. So there are 4 main views on the creation account. Of course, only one is correct. We're going to start by looking at what's called the gap theory. Now, the gap theory was popularized by Scofield, who produced the Scofield Reference Bible, very popular Bible even these days. This is back in the early 1900s, late 1800s, early 1900s. And he promoted a theological view or theological system called dispensationalism. And that's actually a lot of modern Christianity comes from a dispensational standpoint. And that's the view that when it comes to God and how he's dealing with people, he's got 2 different plans. He's got one plan for the Jews, he's got one for the Gentiles, and more specifically, the Gentiles are joined to him through Christ, and they have a heavenly destiny. And that's kind of like the common modern Christianity that I think most of us are familiar with. But we don't accept dispensationalism, at least in that form. And there are different versions of dispensationalism. God has a single plan. And in fact, that's very evident, I think, when you interpret the Bible sequentially and progressively, again, like we're doing. And especially when you don't disconnect the Old Testament from the New, if you understand that it's a single continuous story, then there's less of a tendency to make that separation. Now, Scofield, back in his reference Bible, in Genesis 1:2, he actually changed a word. He changed a single word in that verse in verse 2, and he created, in doing so, he created an imagined and undefined time gap between verses 1 and verses 2. So if you have your Bibles, go to Genesis 1:1 for a second. And I'm reading now from the New King James Version, which does not include the the error that Scofield introduced. But Genesis 1:1 from the New King James says, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was," and that's the key verb, yes, and the key word. "The earth was without form and void, and darkness was on the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters." Now, what Scofield did was he took the word "was," where verse 2 says the earth was without form, and he changed it to the word "became." Implying, in doing so, he implied that the world pre-existed in some kind of a primordial form for an undefined period of time until it became something else. And he says that after some undefined gap, or I should say the gap theory, says that after this undefined gap of time, some kind of catastrophe initiated what Moses is chronicling as the creation days. Let me give you a quote, and this is directly from the preface to the book of Genesis in the Scofield Reference Bible. It says, "Three creative acts of God are recorded in this chapter: the heavens and the earth, the animal life, and human life." And then he says the first creative act refers to the dateless past and gives scope for all geological ages. And if you pause for a second, this is actually a pretty profound statement. The dateless past. And he's basically saying that we have no idea when Genesis or the creation actually occurred. It was sometime way in the past, and having that viewpoint accounts for all the geological ages. Now, this view is actually very much a mixture of Christianity and the theory of evolution, with its belief in billions of years of slow change and random chance. And then Scofield goes on to say about the word day in Genesis, which we take quite literally as a 24-hour day. He says this. He says, "The frequent parable-based use of natural phenomena may warrant the conclusion that each creative day was a period of time marked off by a beginning and end." And what he's saying here is that when Moses says in Genesis account, when he says there was evening and there was night at day one or day two or the first day or the second day, he's basically saying that the word night and day, night and morning don't actually refer to the literal night and morning, but these are just markers of time, a beginning and end of some kind of undetermined period of time. So again, he's interpreting Genesis very non-literally and in a perspective that is consistent with the theories of evolution, which again we reject. But he again says that this day is just the start and the stop of a very long, undefined period of time. Well, there's one really big problem here, and that is that his substitution of the word "became" for the word "was," it's completely arbitrary and honestly, I think a little bit self-serving. The Hebrew word that you'll find if you look at the original Hebrew, the word is haya, and while it can mean became, it's very rare for it to do so. It almost always means was, and there has to be, some kind of compelling reason to import the meaning became into that word. And the word, here's the difference. Become is about a process of change, going from one state to another. The word was is about a steady state of being. It's about a condition. And while they are, from a literary standpoint, somewhat connected, they are, from a meaning standpoint, very, very different. Now, if we look at the Septuagint, the 70 Jews that translated, 72 depending on which account you read, the Jews who translated the original Hebrew into Greek agreed with the word was by using the Greek word eimi. And again, it's about a steady state of being. It's not about a process of becoming. And so, what Scofield did and what the gap theory does is it takes a non-literal view of things like day or morning and evening, and it talks about a process rather than the steady state. And that completely changes what the creation account means. And, just for the record, we reject the gap theory because of its non-literal approach and its apparent blending with the theories of evolution, and honestly for its unfaithfulness to the original text, both in the Hebrew Old Testament as well as the Greek. But there's another theory, and this is called the day-age theory. And the day-age theory looks at the word day and says, well, that just really means age. It doesn't mean 24 hours. It means just a really long period of time. And most people who promote the day-age theory like to use Peter's statement in 2 Peter chapter 3, where he says that a day with the Lord is as 1,000 years. And what they do is they take that statement in Peter and they retrofit it and apply it to the period in Genesis 1 that Moses calls day, but they don't even retrofit it literally. They just say the day could be 1,000,000 years, it could be 1,000,000,000 years, and it's certainly not just 1,000. The problem was that Moses was very, very specific when he said that day was evening and morning. And honestly, it's very hard to get around that because it is the literal scientific fact that a day is defined by the margins of sunrise and sunset, what we call day and morning. But there are a group of Christians that believe in what might be called guided evolution, meaning that they favor this non-literal approach to creation because it fits what they already believe to be true, that while God was the mind and the force behind creation, but he did it through the process of evolution, and again, what we might call guided evolution. Now, we're going to see Peter's statement a little bit later when we talk about just kind of establishing our 6,000-year timeline. And we're going to demonstrate our belief and what we can show actually was the belief of the early church, is that creation, the 6 creation days, are actually metaphors. And I don't want to go too far down into that, but I think most of us, at least in our local fellowship there, are familiar with that. We're going to come back to that later. So those are the first 2 theories. We have the gap theory, we have the day-age theory, and then we also have what's called the Genesis framework hypothesis. So the framework hypothesis also takes a metaphorical approach, and instead of seeing creation as 6 sequential days, which quite literally that's what's stated, this viewpoint that says that of the 6 days that God actually created things, days 4, 5, and 6 are poetic restatements of days 1, 2, and 3, and they're not actually different days. They're just called day 4, 5, and 6, but it's a restatement of what God did on days 1, 2, and 3. And again, it doesn't see Genesis literally, sees it metaphorically, but it also doesn't see it as history, but says that it is from the literary genre called poetry. And here's what it looks like up on the screen there. Basically, they believe that day 4 is just day 1 restated and not actually a 4th day. And part of that is because there's an apparent contradiction between days 1 and day 4. If you look at that up on the screen, it says day 1, God creates light and separates darkness, creating day and night. And then day 4, God creates the sun, the moon, and the stars to govern the day and the night. And so they look at this, and a lot of people do, and say, well, there's a contradiction here. So because we believe the Bible is the inspired word of God, we can't have a contradiction. So therefore, day 4 must just be a restatement of what God did on day 1, because you can't have the sun being created after God created light, right? And there's an error in that thought process, which is, we'll cover that actually coming up in just a little second. So day 4 is just a restatement of day 1. Likewise, day 5 is just really day 2 restated with more details and not actually a 5th day. And then day 6 is just day 3 and not actually a 6th day. So in reality, the Genesis framework hypothesis says that there were only 3 days of creation, whereas the literal reading and account says no, there were actually 6. And we have to understand those things in a way that means, without twisting things, without being illogical, and without importing meaning that's not there, we have to understand the Genesis account in a way that preserves this literal 6-day process, but doesn't allow for conflicts and contradictions. And I believe we can do that. And they obviously see these parallels, right? There is a parallel between day 1 and 4, between day 2 and 5, and between 3 and 6, but it's not the parallel that they think. These things really are all separate days. In reality, what God did on days 1 through 3 is he created, what you might call containers for the creation. And then he filled those containers with the relevant things that either go in them or on them on days 4, 5, and 6. And so in day 1, he created space. And in day 4, he put stuff out there like the sun, the moon, and the stars. Now, I'll break that down here in a second. Some scholars use the words, they say that he formed creation during the first days, and then he filled them during days 4, 5, and 6. And when you take the creation account as 6 literal sequential days, here is actually what it looks like. Now, I use the words habitats and inhabitants. On day 1, God created the habitats of the earth, but more specifically heaven, literally meaning space. I mean, the word literally means anything above the earth. And then on day 4, he filled the space, as I said a moment ago, with the sun, the moon, and the stars. On day 2, he made the containers called the sea and the sky, or maybe more specifically, the atmosphere. And on day 5, he filled the ocean with fish, and he filled the air with birds. And on day 3, he created dry land and vegetation. On day 6, he filled it with the land animals, and then created Adam and Eve on the 6th day. Now, again, if you take a literal view of the book of Genesis, it's very simple, it's very clear. We don't have to jump through any hoops or twist anything to make things what they aren't. And that brings me to the final creation model, which we accept as truth, which is the literal 6-day creation. And we do believe that. We believe this is literal. We believe that this is historical record rather than poetry. And we believe that the earth is almost exactly, or very close to exactly 6,000 years old, which means that we're at the close of the end of the time frame that God prophesied within the 6 days of creation. Again, we'll cover that in a little bit more detail later, and Tim has chronicled all of that in his book, The Time of the End. Now, I want you to know that we could spend so much time just going through scientific evidence for the creation. I'm not going to do that, but I want you to know that there are many well-produced science-based creation ministries out there that can arm you with the proof of the flood, of creation, that the earth is young, it's about 6,000 years old. So I'm just going to give you a list of a couple that we think do quality work. One would be Answers in Genesis. Another one would be the Institute for Creation Research. And then the third would be the Biblical Science Institute, which is actually pretty cool because Dr. Lyle he's a PhD in astrophysics. If you like the space stuff, he's really good. So Answers in Genesis, Institute for Creation Research, and then the Biblical Science Institute. And there are many others out there. In fact, there are many excellent YouTube videos from astrophysicists and geologists and engineers and scientists of different backgrounds that affirm that the earth is young, what we call young earth creation. So we have these literal 6 days of creation, right? The Bible says that God rested on the 7th day, and this is kind of a funny statement because it was God who created the universe. I mean, I really don't think that he gets tired and has to rest. And I want to deal with that first before we go through the creation account. So jump forward to Genesis 2. And this is actually a pretty good time to mention that sometimes the English doesn't capture the original languages very well, especially when we view that English word from our 21st century perspective, because when we say someone rested, it implies that they were tired and they actually needed to rest. So Genesis 2:2 says, "And on the 7th day God ended work," or his work, "which he had done, and he rested on the 7th day from all his work which he had done. Then God blessed the 7th day and sanctified it, because in it he rested from all his work which God had created and made." Now, of course, the 7th day of the week is what we call the Sabbath. In fact, the word that is translated as rested here is a derivative of the root word Shabbat. It's really related to the word Sabbath, and it simply means to stop working. And there's no implication of fatigue. There's no implication of being depleted and having to take time to need recovery. And it's really a statement of ceasing from work or from toil. I like the Septuagint, and again, there are different English translations of the Septuagint, but here's one version that says, "The heaven and the land and all their ornamentation were completed. God completed in the 6th day his works that he did, and he ceased," or another version says he left off on the 7th day from all his works that he did. So obviously he didn't get tired, he didn't rest, he just stopped. And that 7th day, when he stopped, after he said everything was good, in fact he said it was very good, he stopped from his work, and that day of stopping, that day of rest, that Sabbath day, then became a day to memorialize, a day to be sanctified, a day to be holy. Now, we haven't actually read Genesis 1 yet, but I think we've covered a lot of concepts and a lot of ground already. Let's now go back to Genesis chapter 1 and start reading in verse 1. So obviously a very familiar verse, right? And we're just going to try, and let me tell you what I'm doing. I'm just looking at my clock right now. I may end up splitting this particular lesson into two parts. We'll go probably about 50 minutes, maybe an hour. If there's anything left over that I want to make sure that we cover in this particular lesson, I'm going to split it off into a second video, and you guys can watch that on your own because I need to make sure that I stay on a pretty strict time schedule, but there are certain things I just have to cover. So Genesis 1, verse 1, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. I hate to do it, but we're going to stop right there, and we're going to take a look at that particular verse. Now, in the late 1800s, there was an English philosopher and scientist named Herbert Spencer who formulated what had become known as 5 categories of the knowable. And he stated that everything exists within each of these 5 different categories. And these categories are time, force, action, space, and matter. And not only did Spencer formulate these categories, he further stated that there was no room in this model for the spiritual. So obviously he was an atheist and he was a humanist. But if you look closely at Genesis 1:1, Moses actually stated these same categories about 3,400 years earlier. Now, this is not my original observation. This is one of the things that I came upon as I was doing my prep this week. So in the beginning, Genesis 1:1, right? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The phrase in the beginning, that refers to time. And it refers not just to the beginning of our historical time, it actually refers to the creation of time itself. So we have in the beginning, that's time. In the beginning, God, that's force. God was the force behind creation. In the Genesis account, we see God speaking the creation into existence, and you'll see phrases like God said, and it was so, right? Depending on the translation. So we know that God was the force behind. So we have in the beginning, God created. That's action. But it's not just that. It's not just the act of creating things. God actually created the rules that govern how the creation operates. Rules and laws like gravity, the things that govern the tides of the ocean or the orbits of the planet. Now, I want you to write down Job 38, and I want you to go read that on your own this week. And Job 38 is actually one of my favorite chapters in the Old Testament because up until this point, Job had been complaining to God about his lot in life. And at some point, God sits him down and says, listen, you're going to sit there, you're going to take it like a man. I'm going to talk to you. I'm going to tell you what's going on. Of course, that's my paraphrase. But let me just read a few verses. I want you to read Job 38 on your own. Verse 3 says, now prepare yourself like a man. I will question you, and you shall answer me. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Or who stretched out the line upon it? To what were its foundations fastened? Or who laid its cornerstone? When the morning stars sang together, and all the sons of God shouted for joy, or who shut the sea in the doors, or who shut in the sea with doors when it burst forth and issued from the womb. When I made the clouds its garment and the thick darkness its swaddling band, when I fixed my limit for it and set bars and doors, when I said, this far you may come, but no farther, and here your proud waves must stop. Have you commanded the morning since your days began and caused the dawn to know its place, that it might take hold of the ends of the earth and the wicked be shaken out of it? Obviously God is claiming, look around, I did all this. You who are sitting there complaining to me, what is your power and what is your authority? But let me demonstrate mine. So God not only in the beginning created time itself, he wasn't only the force behind the creation and drove the action of creation itself. He set all these rules that govern how the creation operates. He is the absolute master, as Tim has been, translating certain words in the Bible now. He's using the word sovereign overall, and it's over all aspects of the creation itself. So we have in the beginning God created heaven, and that's space. And I'll explain that in a second. And then he said, in the beginning God created heaven and earth. and that's matter. And so when Spencer laid out these 5 categories of the knowable, time, force, action, space, and matter, guess what? Moses did it. 3,400 years before Spencer came up with these categories. Well, of course, Moses didn't do it. God did it, because God spoke to Moses and said, let me tell you about how all this stuff got started. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. But for some reason, Spencer gets all the glory. Now, it's also important to note that God the Father, and I'm being very specific about saying the Father, God the Father exists outside of and greater than all of these things. He is outside and greater than time, outside and greater than space itself, and outside and greater than matter. In fact, when Solomon dedicated the first temple in 1 Kings chapter 8, he said this. He said, but will God indeed dwell on the earth? Because he made the temple for a place to God to reside, right? In the Holy of Holies, you had the Ark of the Covenant, you had the mercy seat with the angels with their wings coming over on top, and that's where God's presence came, the Holy Spirit, the holy breath of God. But that was not the entirety of God. So Solomon said in 1 Kings 8, but will God indeed dwell on the earth? Behold, heaven and the heaven of heavens cannot contain you. How much less this temple which I have built? And so Solomon understood that any manifestation of God on earth was just a portion. It was a limited manifestation of God, because he lives and exists outside of all of these things. Now let's read Genesis chapter 1 again. Verse 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was on the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. Now let's start with some terminology here. Let's start with the word heavens. The Greek actually has it in the singular, so in the Greek it reads, God created the heaven and the earth, rather than the heavens plural. But this word heaven, it's not heaven in the sense of where God dwells, where he's sitting in his temple, or where the Son is seated at his right hand. It's simply the space above earth. That's what it is. The Greek word is ouranos. It's just the space above earth. And from our perspective, it includes the sky where we see the clouds and we see the birds, as well as the space where we see the planets and we see all the constellations. So the word heaven is just space. And just like the word heaven doesn't mean heaven in that modern Christian sense, the word earth doesn't mean the planet Earth. That just simply wasn't a concept at the time. So when Moses wrote, God created the heaven and the earth, he wasn't saying, from my understanding, he created this globe in space that we call a planet. The word earth just simply means land. That's all it means. God created space and he created land. And Moses said that in the beginning, the land was, in the New King James, without form and void. And different translations will render that phrase differently. But essentially what he means, without form and void, is that this thing called earth, this land that was part of the initial creation, was unshaped. It literally, the Greek and the Hebrew both literally means to be unprepared or unorganized. And that might mean something as simple as the land was flat. There was no contour. There were no mountains, right? We don't know exactly what it means, other than it wasn't in the shape that we perceive it to be today. So it was unformed and it was void. And that word void means empty. And if we go back to the concepts of containers and contents, or habitation and inhabitants, the land was unshaped and unorganized, and there was nothing in it, there was nothing on it. In fact, the Septuagint says that the earth was invisible or unseen and unprepared, which I actually prefer that translation a little bit better. But if the Septuagint says that the earth was invisible or unseen, I mean, how was the earth or the land itself unseen? And the truth is, because it was submerged underwater. Go back to verse 2. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was on the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. And that word deep in Greek in the Septuagint is the word abyssos, where we get the word abyss. And this word usually refers to the deepest part of the ocean. It literally means just a deep body of water. And if you've ever been out in really deep water, if you've been out in the middle of the ocean, you know how dark the water can look because it's so deep. It's almost like black. It's not like the waters of the Bahamas or Bermuda where it's so crystal clear and there's so much sunlight that you can see down to the ocean floor depending on how deep the water is. But when you're out in the midst of the ocean, it is so dark. It's like it's almost black. And Moses said that the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. The Greek word here is pharaoh. And it means to carry or be carried along or to move or be moved with the suggestion of force and speed. It's not just like, kind of the Spirit of God was taking a stroll. It was, the Spirit of God was moseying along the face of the deep. No, it said that he was moving along with force and speed, or it was moving along with force and speed. And so what we have in this second verse is we have this picture of a mass of land or dirt and water sitting in the vastness of space. If we just take it very literally and not try to import a bunch of other things, that's all that was there. There was space, and then there was this land covered in water. Apparently, at this point, there's no solar system, right? There's no sun, there's no moon, there's no stars, and the land is submerged in enough water that the water is called the deep or the abyss. Now, modern geologists, they will tell you that if you could level all of the mountains around the world and spread the actual landmass into one flat plain, that there's enough water in the oceans and lakes of the world to cover the land itself to a depth of 9,000 feet. That's almost 2 miles. And that's all around the world. So imagine that this original ball of land covered in water, the land is completely submerged to a depth of maybe 2 miles, close to that. All right, that's the day one creation. So that's what day one looks like, right? It's this ball of dirt sitting under about 9,000 feet of water, suspended in the vast emptiness of space. That's day one. And then something very cool happens in verse 3. Then God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. And God saw the light, that it was good, and God divided the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. So the evening and morning were the first day. And again, we take this very, very literally. Now, if you want to just jump to John 1:1, I think most of you guys know this, and we've talked about it. I think I quoted it last week improperly when I went back and looked at the video. So John says in chapter 1 that the actual hands-on creator was the Son of God, right? John 1:1 says, "In the beginning was the Word," and that's Jesus, or the Pre-Incarnate Christ, I should say. "And the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him, nothing was made that was made." So we have this scenario that the Father spoke the instructions and the Son actually carried out the action. And so, just to clarify your beliefs and, the biblical proof for all of this, as we see it, is in the Bereans Bible Institute series on the Father and the Son. We know that the Father begat the Son, which means the Son did not exist in eternity past with the Father. The Son, too, had a beginning. However, the Son did not have a creation point, but a begetting point, and there is a difference. The Son of God was not created. He was begotten. In fact, in Revelation 3, Jesus refers to himself as the Amen, the faithful and true witness, the beginning of the creation of God. And he uses the same word beginning. In Greek, it's the word arche. He uses the same word that the Septuagint uses in Genesis 1:1, in the beginning. So the Father begets the Son, and he tells him to start creating, which is something that this newly begotten Son has never done before. So the God of Genesis 1:1, doing all the creation, is the Son, creating on the instructions and by the direction of the Father. And the Spirit of God, I'm just going to use the word Spirit. Normally we would use the word breath, but let me just use the word Spirit. The Spirit of God was hovering or moving with force and speed over the face of the deep. And this phrase, Spirit of God, in both the Hebrew and the Greek, literally is the divine breath, right? And we define this and we understand this biblically to be the limited presence of the Father. Because remember, the being that created the time and space and matter cannot be contained within it, so there has to be a limited manifestation. And it's zooming along the surface of the water, checking out this new thing that the Son had made. And again, I say limited presence, as Solomon recognized. Not even the heaven and the heavens of heavens can contain him. So in order for God to appear inside his own creation, he has to somehow limit himself so that he doesn't break it. So then the Son, who is just recently begotten, at the behest of the Father, creates space and makes this land and submerges it in about 9,000 feet, almost 2 miles of water. And then he creates light. Remember, everything was dark up until this point. But, what is darkness? Darkness is just the absence of light. So when the pre-incarnate Christ created light, it actually changed absolutely everything. And when Jesus saw the light, Moses said that he saw that it was good. Now, wouldn't you expect that the pre-incarnate Christ would know ahead of time that the light he was going to make was good? I mean, you kind of would have assumed that, but only if you assume that he had knowledge and experience because he has lived forever in the past with the Father. That's almost the implication or the assumption. And this is, I think, one of those areas where having the right view of things resolves potential conflicts. If you do assume that Jesus was eternally pre-existent and he had all the same knowledge and all the same experience that his Father had, then you would have a hard time explaining how it appears that all of this stuff was new to him. Every time Christ made something during the creation week, the record says that he saw that it was good. 7 times in Genesis 1 alone, Moses tells us this. Now, this word saw, this verb, isn't just the act of seeing. I mean, I could say, I see my coffee, which is getting cold by now. This word saw is more about perception. It's more about seeing something for the first time and understanding it. And this idea that the pre-incarnate Christ was begotten with no experience and had to learn and accumulate knowledge, it's very confusing to most Christians because they are incorrectly taught that the Son is and always has been eternal with the exact same knowledge experience as the Father. And that's not true. So light, the very light that he created, was something new to him. He makes the light and go, wow, that's awesome. And I'm sure he didn't say it that way. He says he saw it and he saw that it was good. And then he takes the light and he divides the light from the dark. And he divides time into the first basic units, evening and morning, a single day, 24 hours, literal. And what we might take this to mean is that he started to spin the earth, this submerged land, this globe out in space, even though Moses wouldn't have known that it was a globe out in space. That's our perspective. Maybe it means he started to rotate it because that's what defines day, right? Day and night is you have a source of light and you have a ball, and the side of the ball that the light is shining to is day, but as the ball rotates, what used to be day now is on the dark side and now it becomes nighttime. So maybe what we're seeing in this day 1 Genesis account was the pre-incarnate Christ creates space and he puts this ball covered in water out there, and then he creates light and he starts to spin it. And now we have day and we have night. Now, I don't want to jump too far ahead here because there is this apparent contradiction between the events of day 1 and day 4. So let's, before I get to it, let me just jump on to day number 2 here. Just hold on to that apparent contradiction between days 1 and day 4 for a moment. So now we have day 2. And day 2 is where God takes some of the water that is covering the land and he, imagine that this is, the water that's covering the land and the land is underneath. Then what God does on day 2 is he takes some of the water that's above the land and he separates it and he elevates it and he creates a space in between the waters above and the waters below. And this is what we call sky or the atmosphere. So day 2, then God said, let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters. Thus God made the firmament and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament, and it was so. And God called the firmament heaven. So the evening and the morning were the second day. Now we have to define a few terms here. The word firmament, the Greek word is stereoma, or at least the root word is stereoma. It literally means firmness or strength or foundation. And it can be used in a non-concrete way. So for example, the concrete example would be like the foundation or the floor, right? I'm building a house and I create the firmament. I create I pour a concrete slab and then I build sticks on top of it. So that's more of a concrete example, but it can be used in a non-concrete sense. Like for example, it might refer to someone's resolve. Peter talks about being steadfast and sure in your faith, and he uses the same word. Right, and also can be used for a supporting structure. And in fact, it was ancient man's perspective that the sky was an arch or a supporting structure that held up everything that was beyond it. So literally, the ancient belief was that the sky supported the sun, the moon, and the stars, that they would never fall down. But in reality, there is a firmness to the atmosphere. Of course, until Christ comes back and reorders everything. So we understand the firmament to be something that's fixed and steadfast. And remember, it doesn't have to be solid or concrete material. Many lexicons define it simply just as an expanse. So when you look up into the sky and you see the expanse of the sky, and then beyond that you perceive that there is like more space out there, and there's planets and constellations and moons and all that. So that's an expanse, and that could also be used the word heaven. Or I'm sorry, firmament. And that actually is the word that's being used for heaven there. So here's the picture on day 2. God takes the water that covers the land. He separates some of them. So there is water above and water below. And this is the atmosphere. And the waters above, maybe that's the moisture that's held in the clouds. And we'll see a little bit later that up until the time of the flood, it appears that there was no rain that fell on the earth, that all the moisture on the land actually came from springs and mist that came up from the earth itself, rather than from rain coming down. Now, if you remember the word heaven, in Genesis 1:1, God created the heaven and the earth. I said that was space. Now, the word heaven can actually mean different things. It just depends on the context. It can refer to generically all of space, anything that's above the land. But now, after this account on day 2, on day 2, we actually have 2 divisions of heaven. We have space, which is the big, everything above the globe of the earth. And then we also have sky or atmosphere, right? And we might call this the first and the second heavens. So the first heaven would be the sky where we see the clouds and the birds. The second heaven would be the space where we see the sun and the moon and the stars and the constellations. And interestingly, in 2 Corinthians 12, in verse 2, Paul says that he was caught up in a vision to the third heaven. And that would be the space beyond the first 2 heavens, right? The space beyond the sky, beyond where all the sun and the moon and the stars are. And that's not so much a location, right? When Paul talks about having this vision and being caught up to the third heaven, he's not so much as saying that he went to a location. It's not like you go, all right, here I am in San Francisco, and kind of like Peter Pan, I just head to that star and turn right and keep going until morning. It's not like I can just keep going and going and going and going and going and actually find God out there somewhere. In fact, we have, posited or speculated in the past that heaven, in the sense of where God lives, where his throne is probably dimensional. It's probably a different dimension than what we live in right now, rather than being a place or a location in this dimension. So when Paul talks about the third heaven, he's using it in a metaphorical sense. He's like, it's out there somewhere, but it's not the sky and it's not the space where the moon and the stars are. I went somewhere else that I can't see, and that's where God is. So that's day 2. It's the formation of the sky as we know it. Now let me deal with day 3. And I'll probably close it and split the rest of it off into that second video that I do want you guys to watch on your own. And please feel free to stick around and have any conversations about this that you want to. So here we are on day 3, and day 3 is where God creates the containers of the seas and the dry land. Moses uses the phrase under the heavens. So now he's referring to the remainder of the water. When he separated the waters, the remainder that was down still covering the earth, the part that wasn't elevated when he created the atmosphere. That's what he's talking about now. So in verse 9 he says, "Then God said, let the waters under the heavens be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear. And it was so. And God called the dry land earth," again land, "and the gathering together of the waters he called seas. And God saw that it was good." Again, he perceived it because he'd never seen this before. Now, we're in verses 9 and 10 where it says, "Let the dry land appear," and he called the dry land earth. In the original language, it's really the word dryness. The word land actually isn't there, but the implication is you make the waters recede by raising up the earth, and part of it's going to be dry and the rest of it's going to be submerged. Now, so remember, up until now, we just have a bunch of dirt or land sitting under a ton of water. And what God does is he moves the waters around to create seas, and he confines the seas or the oceans by raising up part of the submerged land. And so now we have raised land, but we also have submerged land that makes up the ocean floor. Interestingly, both secular and Christian scientists agree that in the beginning, there was a single supercontinent. And if you look at that picture of the globe that I have on the screen there, you can see all the land masses in one big connected piece, right? And this land mass we call Pangea. And we'll deal with it later, but as a result of the flood, the continents broke apart and they started to drift. And so there's space between the pieces now. But back in the beginning, there was a single supercontinent. So again, we have this submerged land, and God raises up part of it, and it forces the water to accumulate into what we now call the seas. But now we have dry land, which we did not have before day 3. Current estimates, and this is without doing things like reforming the mountains, but if we took all the landmass on the earth, secular scientists estimate that, even accounting for space to grow food, that the landmass of the earth can support about 10 billion people. And of course, if you were an atheist, an evolutionist, a humanist, and you believe man is just going to keep procreating and populating the earth, the belief is at some point we're going to run out of space for food and people. And this is where things like eugenics or population control become important to people who don't understand God's story. Because ultimately, the only people who will endure through the kingdom of God and live on into eternity are the ones who have committed to him and been faithful and make it through the kingdom, or into the kingdom and through the kingdom. And so, there's going to be a natural selection, if you will, of the population. And we have plenty of space. We have plenty of space for all the believers of all ages. And that's not even accounting for the possibility that God may stretch out the land. So we don't know. We know that he's going to make new heavens and new earth. And that doesn't mean new in the sense of he's going to create something completely different. It just means he's going to take what we have and refurbish it. He's going to renovate it. So we don't know. I mean, that's exciting to think about. So now God raises up part of the land, and it moves the waters into the seas and the oceans. And now, instead of just having land submerged totally underwater, we have this massive supercontinent. We have a dry place to put animals and to put people, but of course they're going to need food. So after God raises up the dry land, in verse 11, he says, "Then God said, let the earth bring forth grass, the herb that yields seed, and the fruit tree that yields fruit according to its kind, whose seed is in itself on the earth," or on the land. And it was so. "And the earth brought forth grass, the herb that yields seed according to its kind, and the tree that yields fruit, whose seed is in itself according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. So the evening and the morning were the third day." Literal evening, literal morning, source of light, spinning globe, dry land, oceans, and now we have vegetation. Now there's a new concept in these verses here. Moses says that the vegetation and the fruit and the grass and the trees come according to their kind. And he says that its seed is within itself. And here we have the first overt mention or reference to reproduction. And this is also another important doctrinal point that will, I guess I'll explain a little bit of it right now. But, so what we have on day 3 is grass kind, herb kind, and fruit kind, each one having its own seed within itself. And what that means is that grass can't produce herbs, herbs can't produce fruit. And of course, this is quite obvious to you and I. We don't see crossbreeding and reproduction in vegetation. Now, we see hybridization both in a science lab and we see it in nature, right? Things that are of like kind that are two different say versions or subspecies of two different say strains of grass can cross-pollinate and create a hybrid, but it's still grass producing grass, just a different version of grass. Now, man is messing with everything, and we're taking, believe it or not, I don't know if you know this, but we're taking DNA from viruses and injecting it into, or from insects and injecting it into food. I mean, we're creating literally these like Franken foods. We're doing it with animals. Man, secular science is messing with creation, and I don't think God is going to take that too kindly when he comes back and he knows we're doing it, but actually, says, hey, it's time to pay the bill for all the wicked things that you've done. So we have these different kinds, right? We don't see cross-species breeding and reproduction. We don't see it in vegetation. We also don't see it with man and animals. And forgive me for the analogy. I mean, man can only produce man. Man cannot reproduce with animals. And even the word mankind, I mean, just think about that. It's not just mankind, it's mankind, as opposed to animal kind or vegetation kind. And this basic understanding of biology and DNA and its role in reproduction, I think, helps us with a couple of things that we see in the Bible. And I'll finish off day 3, and then we'll call it quits for now, and I'll create that second video for you. The first thing is that among living beings and creatures, we can identify 4 kinds. We have animal kind, which, I would include creatures of the land, the sea, and the air. Then we have mankind, of which we have, male and female. We have different ethnicities and cultures, but we're all mankind. Then there's angel kind. And there's, really, there's no references. There's no evidence, not evidence. There's no indication in scriptures how God created angels or exactly when. It was, in the beginning. We know that because Satan was with Adam and Eve in the garden. We'll get to that story probably next week. So we have mankind and animal kind. We have angel kind, which is clearly distinct. They have powers and capabilities that are different than us. In fact, Hebrews talks about Jesus in chapter 1. He talks about how God made him a little lower than the angels. When he made him a human, he was lower than the angels. So we know that angel kind and mankind are completely different, and they cannot crossbreed. And then we have God kind. And God kind, prior to the incarnation of Christ, when he came as a man, prior to that, there was only 2 God kind. And there was the Father and there was the only begotten pre-incarnate Son. And then at some point, the Son gave up his God kindness and became mankind. And that's when he came and was born of a virgin. So of these 4 kinds, only God kind is not created. Animals were created, man was created, and then they procreate. Angels were created beings. The Father himself has no beginning and was neither created nor begotten. The Son was begotten in his pre-incarnate existence. In the beginning, the Son was not created, he was begotten. The Father took him out from within himself. He was, Jesus said, I proceeded forth out from within the Father. That would be a very literal translation of what he said in the Gospels. And when the Father begat the Son, he gave us the very occurrence of like begetting like, or kind begetting kind. But as I mentioned before, he became fully human, right? In Philippians 2, the Son was born as a human. He emptied himself of everything that made him God kind to become fully mankind. And you can't be both. Again, this is one of those areas where an understanding of how this works is very important, because you can't have hybrids. Jesus cannot be fully man and fully God. Not only is it illogical, you can't be fully two separate things. There are no hybrids. There's no fully man, fully God, and there's no giants there were no giants that were created when fallen angels mated with humans. People who believe that are saying that two different kinds can procreate and reproduce. That's pagan mythology, right? That's paganism, and we reject that. We absolutely reject that thought. Only animals and man then procreate and reproduce. And there are two statements about the resurrection that suggest that angels do not reproduce. And there's only one reference in Zechariah chapter 5 that hints that there might actually be female angels. If you want to read that, because I don't think it's something that people even consider, that there could be female angels. But just read the account of Zechariah 5 and just see what you think. Form your own opinion on that. But basically, again, statements that Christ made about the resurrection, he talks about how angels neither marry nor are given in marriage. Now, it's not a direct statement of they don't reproduce, but if angels are only males, there is no reproduction. But if there are female angelic beings that Zechariah 5 may suggest, it still appears that they don't procreate. And they certainly, if they don't procreate with each other, they certainly don't procreate with man. And we'll deal with that again when we get to Genesis chapter 6. All right, let me leave it there. We've covered the first 4 days of creation. We've just done that in just about an hour's time. So we'll go ahead and close today and then look for that second video. And I'll finish off chapter 1 with days 4, 5, 6, and then briefly again chapter 7. It won't take me that long. So please make sure that you watch the video before I am with you again next week. God bless, and we'll talk to you soon. Take care.